Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into the quiet, forgotten corners of Canada, the kind of places where small towns sit between forests and frozen lakes, and where people learn very early that some things are better left unspoken. These are not old legends whispered by grandparents or stories meant to scare children around campfires. These are documented events, cases that investigators tried to explain, situations authorities struggled to understand, and moments that ordinary people experienced but never truly recovered from. In places where everyone knows each other's names, it's easy to assume nothing truly terrible could remain hidden for long. But sometimes the most disturbing secrets grow quietly behind ordinary doors, beneath old buildings, or in places that seem harmless during the day. What you're about to hear are accounts told by people who are simply living their lives until something changed. Something small at first, something easy to dismiss, until it wasn't. My name is Alfie. For 11 years, I worked at Hendricks Hardware on Main Street in Winnipeg. It was the kind of place that smelled faintly of sawdust, oil, and old metal. I opened the store every morning at 6 sharp. No matter the season, no matter the weather, I arrived before sunrise. My routine never changed. I'd unlock the front door, disarm the alarm system, switch on the fluorescent lights, and start the coffee machine behind the counter before the first customers wandered in. After more than a decade, I knew every inch of that building. I knew which shelves collected the most dust and which floorboards creaked under heavier weight. I knew exactly where to find hardware from every decade the store had been open. In the back, we kept a salvage section filled with older parts. Vintage hinges, antique locks, iron brackets salvaged from demolished buildings around the city. Most customers ignored that section entirely, but one man didn't. His name was Marcus Webb. Marcus owned an antique shop 3 blocks east on Portage Avenue. I had seen him around town before he ever came into the store. Winnipeg isn't enormous, and after years working in the same neighborhood, you start recognizing faces. Marcus was in his late 60s, tall and thin, with silver hair always combed perfectly back. Even during the harsh Manitoba winters, he wore tailored blazers, the kind that looked like they belonged in another decade. He started visiting Hendricks Hardware every Wednesday. At first, there was nothing strange about it. Plenty of antique dealers buy restoration supplies from hardware stores. Marcus would browse the salvage shelves slowly, examining each item carefully before making his selections. But he always bought the same categories of things: old brass locks, vintage door hinges, iron chains. Sometimes he would stand beneath the harsh fluorescent lights holding a piece of metal close to his face, running his fingers over it as if he were reading something written across the surface. He never rushed. He paid in cash every time. At first I assumed he was restoring antique furniture or repairing doors in the old houses around town. But as the weeks passed, something about his purchases began to stand out. By early October, his selections had become different. He started asking for items designed specifically for security or containment. Heavy chains thick enough to anchor equipment, padlocks no longer manufactured, old iron bolts from our oldest salvage bins. When I asked what he was working on, Marcus simply smiled in a thin, polite way that never reached his eyes. He said nothing. He just counted out the cash, collected his purchases, and left. Around the same time, something else happened. One afternoon in October, my co-worker Jenna and I attended a marketing seminar at the Winnipeg Community Center. It wasn't particularly interesting, mostly lectures about improving small business visibility, but the lunch break gave everyone time to talk. Jenna mentioned that her cousin had been missing for 3 weeks. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. Sarah lived alone in a basement apartment near the University of Manitoba. According to Jenna, Sarah had simply vanished. No note, no signs of struggle. Her car remained parked outside her building. When police checked her apartment, they found the door locked from the inside. Her phone sat on the bed with a completely drained battery. At the time, I remember feeling uneasy hearing about it, but Winnipeg is a large city, and people disappear more often than we'd like to believe. I didn't connect it to Marcus Webb. Not then. The second disappearance happened in November. I was reorganizing the salvage section when another customer mentioned a story on the local news. A woman named Patricia Chen had failed to show up for work at a dental clinic. When police entered her home during a welfare check, everything inside looked normal. Dishes were still in the sink. Her coffee mug sat half full on the counter, but Patricia herself was gone. 2 weeks later, another person disappeared. David Hurst, a 48-year-old accountant who lived on Wellington Crescent. His wife had been visiting family out of town. When she returned home, she found his wallet on the nightstand and his car still parked in the garage. He had simply vanished. By December, 5 people had disappeared in Winnipeg. All of them lived alone. All of them left their homes looking as if they had stepped out briefly and never returned. Police held press conferences and promised they were investigating, but there were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong, and no evidence of violence. Authorities suggested voluntary disappearances. Maybe the victims had decided to leave their lives behind. The explanations didn't sit right with me. I started clipping newspaper articles. I watched the evening news every night. I wrote down details in a notebook that I kept beside my bed. And during all of this, Marcus Webb continued to visit the store every Wednesday. 1 week in late December, he walked in and went straight to the back of the building where our oldest items were stored. He selected an antique mirror that had been sitting in inventory since the 1980s. The frame was carved with twisted faces and reaching hands. It had always made customers uncomfortable, which was probably why no one had ever bought it. Marcus studied the mirror for several minutes before asking if we had anything even older. Anything with more history. I remembered a piece we had stored in the back room from an estate sale years earlier. It was a large Victorian mirror with a dark mahogany frame and glass that rippled slightly when you looked at it from certain angles. When Marcus saw it, he became completely still. He examined the mirror silently for nearly 10 minutes. Then he bought it without asking the price. I helped him carry it out to his car. He drove a black Lincoln Continental parked near the curb. When we placed the mirror carefully into the back seat, I noticed the trunk was slightly open. Inside were several pieces of furniture: a bed frame, a dresser, a wooden nightstand. They looked valuable, but something about them felt strange. The surfaces were worn in ways that suggested recent use. Marcus noticed me looking. Without saying a word, he closed the trunk. He thanked me politely, got into the driver's seat and drove away. I stood in the freezing parking lot for a long time after he left. Something about that moment stuck with me. That evening, instead of going straight home, I walked past Marcus Webb's antique shop. The building sat on an older section of Portage Avenue in a structure built sometime around 1912. The display window was filled with lamps, chairs, and decorative objects. But what struck me was that nothing had changed. I had passed the shop many times over the past few months, and the display was exactly the same every time. The same lamps, the same chairs, the same paintings, as if nothing inside had ever been sold. I stepped closer to the glass door and looked inside. The store was dark. A single light glowed faintly in the back corner, where a desk sat beneath a large portrait hanging on the wall. I couldn't clearly see the face in the painting, but the figure seemed to be watching the room. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something else. On the floor near the back of the shop was an ornate rug, and beneath it, just barely visible around the edges, was the outline of what looked like a trapdoor. That was the moment when curiosity began turning into something else, something closer to obsession. Over the next few weeks, I began researching the building. At the public library, I searched property records dating back more than a century. Marcus Webb had purchased the building in 1996. Before that, it had been vacant for nearly 7 years. Before that, it had served as a storage facility. And before that, decades earlier, it had been owned by a man named Dr. Ernest Whitmore. Whitmore had operated a private medical practice in the basement. Newspaper archives described him as a physician who studied criminal behavior and mental illness. But the articles were vague, almost deliberately vague. I started watching Marcus more carefully after that, and eventually, curiosity pushed me to do something I still regret to this day. Something that would lead me to the basement of that building. Something that would change my life permanently.